to welcome everyone to our panel discussion. We know this discussion is called Can War Be Just? And when we planned this about a month and a half ago, we wanted this to be a timely discussion about current issues, but we didn't realize how timely it would be. So we have excellent panelists, and I think it'll be an enlightening hour of your time. Let me do some quick introductions. We'll start down there with Mary Fieflies. Okay. She has a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution. The highlight of her graduate studies was spending a year overseas, during which time she attended graduate level classes at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. She has been a student and employee at Moraine Valley since 1994. To her left is the Honorable Andrew Sabine. He is a full-time faculty member who teaches philosophy and humanities here at Moraine Valley. His graduate work is in philosophy, theology, English, and some work in history. He's been a busy guy. He has been a Greek Orthodox priest and has come in contact with a wide range of people and cultures. He is fluent in Greek and Arabic and is a faculty advisor to Moraine Valley's Arab Student Union. To his left is our moderator, Bill Droll. Bill has been the campus minister for a number of years now. He's been an adjunct instructor and a leader and very active member of our campus community, and I'm very glad to have him as our moderator. And finally, last but not least, to his left is Darren Schreck. He's a full-time teacher here, political science. He holds a master's degree from Appalachian State University and is working on his PhD in political science from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Bill has instructions, and he's warned me that he will keep this conversation going at all costs, which means he may cut off our panel members. He has free will to cut any of you off who are making comments or asking long questions, and so be warned if you're out there. This is an open discussion, so if you have comments, questions, raise your hand, wait for Bill to give you the nod, and you'll be brought into the conversation. So we look forward to it. So thank you for coming, and then I'll turn it over to Bill.
Troy, you make me sound mean. That's not the deal here. We've only got very limited time, so we are going to be expeditious in our use of that time. And I do forewarn the panelists, I'm going to make this audience-centered. So we're going to really key in on your questions, and I will ask the panel members to keep their comments to a succinct minimum. We're using, to give some framework or structure to this conversation, we're using the just war theory. And we're using this not only because it's a convenient device in which to frame our conversation, but because President George Bush has used the just war theory to talk about his foreign policy. This is a theory that dates all the way back to the 3rd century, and it originated with St. Augustine. I might quickly point out, it was not ever meant to justify war, it was meant to limit war. And there's various renditions of the just war theory. Some of the panelists, I think, are going to explain it a little bit. I'm going to just try to list quickly 4 of the principles of the just war theory, and I take this list from an article provided by former President Jimmy Carter last week in the New York Times. For a war to be just, the war must be waged by a legitimate authority. So what that means is that it has to be waged by a state. It cannot be a terrorist group or some kind of rump group. A war has to be waged by a competent authority. Number 2, war can be just only as a last resort. All other means of settling a dispute through negotiations have to be explored, tried, and found wanting. So war has to be a last resort. Number 3, there has to be a proportionality. The good that is expected to come out of the war must be proportional to the damage inflicted, the damage expected by the war. In other words, it's got to be a serious reason, and there has to be some proportion. And finally, care must be taken to protect non-combatants and to observe all other accords of war. Today we would know them as the Geneva Accords. So the war, the waging of the war, the conduct of the war itself also has to be waged in a just manner. So with that as a framework, we're going to start. I'm going to ask the panelists, and then I'm going to welcome questions from the students. Is this war a just war?
History will determine whether this is a just war or not. History will determine it. It's a little bit early to evaluate whether this is going to be a just war or an unjust war. The world obviously is somewhat confused about this, and so we have to look in terms of history and see what the ultimate consequences of this action will be.
I think its justification is sort of relative as to who's in charge. I mean, we can always justify things that we do.
Into the mic louder.
Sorry. Yeah. You know, we justified our action in Kosovo, which a lot of people were against, and we justified our inaction in preventing genocide in Rwanda. So I think we justify it again, that it's relative to who's in charge and to what aims those people that are in charge, what aims they have.
I agree that history is going to determine whether or not this is a just war. However, there are many different interpretations of what a just war is. And I think it's appropriate that if anybody has any questions to ask, that if you do not agree with what the definition of Jimmy Carter or the definition of a just war by St. Augustine is, then by all means give your interpretation and we can have a healthy debate.
All right, now, please, questions from the students. That's most important.
When you say history, what do you mean history? History of America, history of Iraq, history of what they do? What do you say history of
Reflecting on what Mary just said a few moments ago, it depends on who's doing the reading.
Can you repeat the questions? I don't think some people in the back could hear.
She wants to know who determines, or what determines, or what nation or nations determine historically whether it was a just or unjust war. And the response to that is, if you read enough history books, because all history books are prejudiced, you'll find the truth eventually. So the bottom line is, in my view, there are some precedents for this action. I see the world as not black and white, but with much gray. Here in the United States, we have a tendency sometimes to look at issues in a black and white context. Europeans and Asians and Africans don't look at the world the way we do sometimes, because they have experienced in those parts of the world many non-stable situations. We have been very luxurious in having a relatively peaceful history here, with the exception of the Civil War and the recent horror of 9/11.
I would clarify that also by saying that history is usually written by those who win. You know, history is usually written by the winners. I'm of Greek descent myself, and I went to a Greek Orthodox private school growing up, and I grew up with a lot of propaganda about how horrible Turkey was, and how, you know, what a horrible country it was, and how many horrors that it inflicted on Greeks. And now in recent years, Greece is starting to sort of rethink that mode of education, and they are starting to rewrite their history books so that students that grow up get a different perspective that's not so one-sided. So while it's true that history is usually written by the winners, I think that we can sort of be aware of how we write that out, and it depends on whose textbook you're reading.
And I would like to add that in terms of a just war, all of you who are students know this, information is constantly coming at us day in and day out. And we don't know the entire synopsis of what is going on, whether it's by government censorship or whether it's because we, as a people, don't go out and find out the information for ourselves. So therefore, the history books are always written constantly over and over and over again. And therefore, we won't have an answer necessarily right now of whether or not this is a just war.
What yardstick is used to measure whether a war is just or whether it's a good enough reason?
If you look at what's going on now,
Can you repeat the question?
okay, the question is, what is the yardstick of what determines a just war? My interpretation of a just war can come from the United States Constitution, the country that is in charge of the situation, the country that is making the initial attempt to become the aggressor or to defend itself. Or you could look at it from the standpoint of an international organization. A lot of what's going on today has been determined by the interpretation of what the United Nations is all about. So we're coming from the standpoint of what the Parliament believes in Canada, in Britain, what the Parliament believes in Turkey, and then the United States Congress, the United States Constitution, and international organizations like the United Nations.
Well, say something more about that. I mean, since the Second World War, there has been a general consensus that there needs to be a competent world authority to broker or manage the disputes around the world. They're no longer provincial disputes, and the only viable organization that fits that kind of definition today is the United Nations, and yet we're in a situation now where the United Nations has been put to the sidelines, and a situation is being played out somewhat impervious of the thinking of the United Nations.
I would also add to that we tend to, as the United States being the world's only superpower at the moment, we do tend to undermine the authority of the UN all the time. The UN cannot work unless all of its members back it up. I mean, its idea, its concept is wonderful. The idea that it's about collective security, about trying to promote peacekeeping throughout the world. But if we constantly undermine it, we undermine its very principles. Then one can ask the question: then what is the point of it then? If we are constantly trying to find a loophole to get around it because we're afraid of somebody using a veto power, what is then the point of the United Nations?
Yeah, please.
In that I teach philosophy, I have to become philosophical. I think that we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. In terms of the classical definition of just war, has the world exhausted all peaceful means, and I know we're all referring to Iraq, obviously. Have we exhausted all peaceful means in terms of inspections in order to be satisfied to proceed with military action? That has to be asked. Secondly, another question has to be asked. If it is the position of the United States administration to reconfigure Iraq, will this include input from Iraqis who've been defectors for a long while? There's been some recent testimony on their behalf that they feel as though they're not involved in this process now. This is another philosophical issue. So we have to look at these questions very, very carefully.
To go back to the UN, if the UN can't agree, so effectively one person vetoes everything, then it's like a dictatorship, really, isn't it? I mean, if one country can veto everyone's action, if we have to wait for the UN to act, if someone decides, if France, for instance, decides to never agree, ever, then who's the sovereign? Who's the country? What do we surrender along those lines?
Well, the idea behind each member state, and to clarify this, we're talking about the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. They are basically the governing body. They are the ones that can decide when we go to war, when the United Nations go to war. That will be the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And the reason that each country was given a veto was to prevent those countries from going to war. That was the very idea of it in the first place. So the idea of it is a wonderful idea in theory, but if you don't have the political will to back it up, I mean, that just seems to be what it comes down to all the way around. If there is no political will to back that up, then again, we question the whole legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council.
And one
Mary, repeat that point. The reason those 5 nations are on the Security Council is what? So how did they get, just to clarify why they got...
It was done, after World War II, the United Nations was set up. And the reason that it was set up that way was to prevent, and I'll mention what we talked about before. The idea that, because my master's is in conflict resolution, the idea about conflict resolution is that you cannot always prevent conflict, and that conflict is not always a bad thing. The idea is that you make something good come out of something bad. And one can make the argument with World War II that we had a lot of good things come out of World War II, the United Nations being one of them. So the idea was that each country, each one of these main countries, the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia, would have veto power in order to prevent those countries from ever being drawn into a major war like World War II.
Well, I just have to make a point with the UN nations. If, they're coming from the point, yes, as September 11th, if you go back and think about that, if another nation under the UN nation, if they're the 5 major powers, they're going to be, making the decisions and, basically having the final decision on the say-so. If one of those are attacked, like we were, does that justify other nations not backing us up because we were attacked?
May I respond to that?
Yeah.
Were we attacked by Iraq? Is that what you're asking?
Not by Iraq, but just...
We have to be careful about this. The term terrorism is being used, and we were victimized by terrorism, as we all know, horribly. But we have to be careful with terrorism, because terrorism is a type of force. It's like a snake that bites, and then it hides its head. The question we have to ask ourselves in terms of war, because we're going to war tonight, does Iraq represent a direct threat to the United States and Great Britain as we speak, or its interests at the present time? That's a philosophical question we have to ask ourselves. And we have to be careful about terrorism in terms of who are the terrorists, who is involved, where are they, and where are they coming from? Bear in mind that the majority of the terrorists on those planes were from Saudi Arabia.
And I think that what your question also, what you're basically asking that I interpreted from it was, and I'd be curious to see what everyone's opinion on this is there, how many of you in this room think that there is a link between what happened on September 11th and what's going on in Iraq right now? Do we think there's a link between the two? How many of you do not think that there is a link between the two? So I'd say the majority seems to think that there is not a link. Because to me, in my opinion, it seems that only in the last month or so have you been hearing more about this link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. You didn't hear that too much early on. That link has been somewhat more of a recent thing, which leads me to believe that it's done for a specific reason.
If there's no doubt that the United States of America, there's no doubt that the United States of America has economical interest in oil supplies of Iraq. How would you comment on that?
Oil. The question is oil. We'll answer the question.
Yes. If Saddam Hussein had been destroyed in 1991, would September 11 still have occurred?
Okay, for your first question about Saddam Hussein being taken out in 1991, the reason that he was not to begin with was because the only way that President Bush the first was able to do what he did and have Arab countries on our side was by promising not to go into Baghdad to begin with. So a lot of people today are saying, well, he should have gone after and done the job to begin with. But he did not. We would not have had the coalition that we did if he had not made that promise.
No, but if he had, let's say he had been taken out. Let's take that scenario. If he had been taken out, would September 11 still have occurred?
I think that would depend also on what troops we still had in Saudi Arabia, because part of the reason, from my understanding of why Osama bin Laden had such a major grief with the United States to begin with, was because of U.S. troops being on Saudi soil.
Let me react to that. In terms of the Middle East, we have to understand that Saddam and bin Laden ideologically are on two different planes. Saddam is a secularist Muslim. Mr. bin Laden is a religious, and forgive my Muslim brothers and sisters for saying this here, because we have many guests here of Muslim background, he's a religious fanatic. And so ideologically, these two are not really allied in that sense in terms of their Muslim disciplines. The question is, would 9/11 have occurred? I mean, we don't have a magic wand to figure that out. But one of the major issues with the people who follow bin Laden, in addition to U.S. troops on Saudi territory, is the historic position of the United States regarding the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where they feel many of the people who advocate for the Palestinians feel that the United States has had an unjust policy in terms of the occupation of the Palestinian people. And bin Laden has used that as one of his major movements.
About Saddam Hussein, in 1991, the goal of the coalition forces was not to overthrow Saddam Hussein, as we know. It was basically to protect Kuwait because of its sovereign nation status. In terms of the question about oil, I don't have a magic ball to know, or magic wand to figure out whether or not the United States has ties to Iraq, and if, in terms of oil and oil producing. And at the same time, you can also make the argument that the reasons why France and Germany and other countries like them, they don't want to get involved for the same reason that someone might ask that the United States is getting involved for oil.
What doesn't this war? What doesn't it make this war? Can you tell me what doesn't this war make justified? The theory justified. I want to know: is there any flaws in this war being justified?
I think the first flaw, and in any situation, asking the question of whether or not this war is justified, and if there are any flaws that go along in this war. Number one, I basically tell this to all my students, and we talked about this yesterday and the day before. Communication is important. George Bush standing up saying that this is a crusade, and that's not a good thing. That's not a good start, because the word crusade has a religious emphasis to it. So the first flaw that I would say is communication right from the get-go. You can determine whether or not this is about self-defense, which would make it a just war. Defending your own interest, which would also make it a just war, in my opinion. But at the same time, communication has to start right from the beginning, saying that this is a war to protect our interests, to protect our allies, to protect our interests overseas and at home. And I don't think that has been carefully done from the start.
What major effects will this war have on our economy?
Effects on the domestic economy.
That's a very good question. I mean, from articles that I've been reading, it's estimated to cost a lot of money. And since we don't have the coalition that we had in 1991, in which most of our allies footed the bill, that means that you and I are going to be pretty much responsible for maintaining Iraq. And depending on how much damage we have to inflict in order to take it over, basically Iraq is going to could become something like a 51st American state, where we're going to be basically paying for everything that goes on there, and that's going to cost a lot of money. Did you want to make a point to that, or can I?
Go ahead. I just want one additional point. The administration is stating that at a minimum, after defeating Saddam's forces, occupation will minimalistically be 2 years. 2 years. Bear in mind, we're still in Afghanistan, Bosnia, etc., etc. So you ask yourself how much economically this is going to cost us.
Yeah, Bosnia was originally only supposed to be a 1-year thing, and we're going on 8 years now, and we're still there. So it's not going to be. This is not going to be short term. And part of this, if I may just make a point, is partly the fault of American culture to begin with. we're very much people that we think in the here and the now. We want instant gratification on things. And we don't tend to think in terms of longevity. That was one of the reasons for our defeat in Vietnam. That we did not, I mean, the Vietnamese people were thinking in terms of 100 years. We were thinking in terms of 6 months. And so that's partly a weakness of our own culture, that we don't always tend to look at things in the long term.
First, Derek.
And one other thing, in terms of the economy, I think the better question, or I shouldn't say better question because I don't want to minimize what you said. What is this going to have politically on the Bush administration in 2004? Will people ignore the economy if you win the war? But if you remember, with Bush's father, you won the war, but you didn't forget about the economy.
Back to your point about defending our interests, giving us a justified going to war. I have a difficulty with that. We could say back in '53 in Iran, defending our oil interests, we put a dictator back in power. Guatemala, we caused a coup there, defending our banana interests. Dominican Republic, '65, Chile, 1973. We have this history of defending our interests and doing really bad things. I don't see this as being a legitimate cause. I can see it would be a direct thing. The other thing is the grounds for this war keep shifting. They keep moving the grounds, so they giving us all this disinformation and spin on everything. So half the people in the United States right now think that Iraq is responsible for 9/11. And there was not one Iraqi on those. There were 15 Saudis, there were Emiratis and Egyptians. We're not attacking them.
Some comment here?
Can you summarize the question? What is the comment?
Okay. I was going to, we don't really have a very good historical track record. This gentleman was referring to our history as a superpower of sort of deposing and implanting rulers at our whim, pretty much. And we don't really have a very good track record for this. And I would agree with you on that.
Speaking of Iran, we backed Mr. Saddam against Iran back in the late 80s. So there's been an in and out door in regard to this issue. So we go on and on. And bin Laden was an ally of ours for a while. In where? Afghanistan against the Russians. We supplied bin Laden with military hardware, which they still use.
To clarify, can I clarify a point very quickly? Okay.
This is partly with his comment that he made. The grounds keep on shifting for this war, and the media keeps on spitting out different reasons that we're going to war. And I've heard different things like they have chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. Well, then why aren't we waging war? Why aren't we waging war against North Korea? And why don't we lead by example? I mean, we could blow this earth up like 20 times over and still have more weapons to Satan. And they tell you that we're replacing a despot regime. And why aren't we waging war against Saudi Arabia, which is considered the closest Arab ally? Because they are a despot regime, the Saudi family. And they tell you that we want to bring democracy to Iran. Well, aren't they a sovereign country which is allowed to rule their people the way they wish? I mean, where do we come off as telling a country, you cannot rule this way, we want to bring democracy to you? And the last thing I've heard is violation of UN resolutions. I mean, if we're going to go wage a war against a country that keeps on violating UN resolutions, we might as well wage war against Israel. Because Israel has violated many UN resolutions, and Ariel Sharon is a war criminal. And he has been brought to court based on war crimes that he has committed in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. So I mean, if all these reasons that the media spits at us, all this propaganda that they spit at us, can easily be broken. There is no strong argument here.
You have a good command of history.
Excuse me, could you either paraphrase what they're saying or give them a mic?
Well, very, very simply, what she was saying is she was citing historical examples where our history has had, our country has had an erratic history and inconsistencies in affirming or denying issues that, for instance, she referred to the Israeli situation. That's Resolution 242, where Israel has been in constant violation of that United Nations resolution for many, many years. The point is, North Korea is another one. I think the implication, again, philosophically, is that there's an ethical issue about we choose who we want to go after when it's convenient. Am I correct? and we let other things that are obviously human rights violations go unresponsive on our part because we don't see it fitting in our world scheme. Is that correct?
We have a very short-sighted foreign policy, no matter which president you're talking about. If you go all the way back to John Adams, when he declared what is called a quasi-war with France, he declared it on his own because he didn't like the fact that the French didn't appreciate the United States getting territory from the British. We have a short-sighted foreign policy in this country. And to make a point about what you were saying about the UN, notice how the UN is not enforceable with its policies. No matter which country you were talking about, think of it this way. 2 countries in its history, in the UN's history, vetoed the most, and foreign policy still took place in other countries. Those 2 countries, the Soviet Union and the United States. Yet foreign policy in countries that were affected by the veto still carried forward.
Yeah, I had a question. Like after 9/11, our country was pretty much guarded for war against terrorism. And I remember relating back to like CNN, just watching TV and talking about that. I don't see how us going to war with Iraq, even though Saddam is a head figure in all this, is necessarily stopping the war on terrorism. I don't think we have the capability, or at least I think our country has proven that they really don't have the capability to stop terrorism at this moment. So I believe that it's kind of like they're staging a war against Iraq to kind of, clean things up a little bit as far as all this mess that's been going on the last 2 years.
Deflect from the war on terrorism.
The question is, will waging war on Iraq or sending a message to Iraq really have any practical impact on homeland security? Mary, did you want to say?
No, that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Seeing as the war in Iraq is being construed as a part of the war on terrorism, and seeing that the United States is the only country in the world called by the World Court as a terrorist state for its mining of the harbors of Nicaragua in support of the Contras, I'd like to ask the panel what it sees as the real difference between war and terrorism. Is there a difference, and what is it?
Very good. Good question is kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation. Any difference between war and terrorism?
I would say that again is relative as to who's in charge. I mean, for some people could look at, I'll use my, since I studied in Northern Ireland, some people view the IRA as freedom fighters, others view them as terrorists. Again, it's relative to your position and to sort of what side of the fence that you sit on. So, and again, it's also, whether it's war or terrorism, is also how legitimate, whether or not it's being backed by a legitimate government or not. I mean, one can make, I'm sure that there are students in this room that would make the argument that Israel's responsible for state-sponsored terrorism. I mean, and again, that's relative as to your position, your background, your ethnic background, etc.
How may we be objective about this?
Pardon me?
How can we be objective about this?
It's a very good question.
What?
How can we be objective to this is what his question was.
In question to the fact that the effect on terrorism, people say that it won't have an effect on terrorism. I think it will. Saddam Hussein is the biggest money launderer for all terrorist cells. That has been known fact. And also, in response to the fact that we're attacking Iraq, we're really not. Saddam Hussein, and people say that the UN has its problems, and it does. That's not part of the argument, but the fact that Iraq for 12 years has been in violation, even after the first Bush went in there and set things straight, or at least so we thought, they kept on going in violation. They kicked out inspectors. Near 15 revolution, and 13 years later, we're at the same spot we were in 91, with the exception that they have the ability of grabbing technology that could severely hurt our nation, as Osama did on September 11th.
Yes. Okay. Right now we're going into wars with different countries. For example, like after September 11th, it was Afghanistan. Now it's Iraq, and almost all Muslim countries are under occupation of some sort from America. What do you have to say about that? I mean, if you look at it, it's mostly a war against Muslims and not countries.
The first gentleman that spoke, again, both of these young people that just raised questions indicate that our nation at the present time is probably roughly 50% divided on this issue. right down the line. And I think it goes back to, subjectively speaking, what shoes you're wearing, where you're living, and all this is very, very difficult to analyze in 1 hour. So we're allowing a lot of this for the expression of individual opinions, and we want you to vent out with us, and that's why we're doing this. But both of these young people just spoke of 2 views regarding the recent movements today toward Iraq. And I know many Muslims feel that their territory has been occupied unjustly by Western forces. There are others in the West who feel that some reaction has to take place from the West. They feel threatened. So it's a paranoia on both sides, and it is at dangerous proportions. And that's why I will go back to my original point that until all means peacefully of verifying, validating alleged weaponry are exhausted, until that point, I personally don't think a war is justified. I feel that at the same time that President Bush is taking a big risk. The next 10 days will tell. The next 10 days will probably tell whether we are going to have a long-term visit there or a short-term visit there in terms of military action. But our nation is divided on this issue.
Darren and Andrew, or others, I'd like to get you to comment on the religious angle of this proposition. Is there really a religious side to this? What does all of this have to do with Islam? It's come up a couple of times.
Well, I want to make the young lady in the back that mentioned about, I could be wrong, but it seems that many of my Muslim students tend to feel that this is turning out to be almost a war against Islam. Is that kind of
yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
It's everywhere. Palestine. I mean, America is supporting Israel to hurt Palestinians, and then you got Afghanistan, Iraq, and another 100 countries probably, and they're under law. I mean, they don't even know about half of them. Most of them are Muslims.
I wanted to make a comment about the way that we do tend to generalize in this country. One of my students yesterday in class is a girl of Palestinian descent, and she was telling me that once the war begins for her, it's going to be very, very difficult just to be out in the street. That just even now that people say to her, well, do you have family in Iraq? And, not realizing that there's a difference between Iraq and being Palestinian, that there are differences. And it's the same way that we tend to generalize other parts of the world, like Africa. We assume that because everybody in Africa, because they all might be one color, they must obviously all be of the same mind and the same culture and the same history, and they're very ethnically diverse. And that's, again, I think a weakness of not only Americans, but I think of Western countries in general, that we don't tend to take enough time to get to know the differences between people.
I would like to react. Specifically, Iraq is an interesting country. It's not an all-Muslim country. There's been a large minority of Chaldean Christian Catholics that have existed there for many, many centuries. We have a division in Iraq between Kurds in the north. We have Sunni and Shiite Muslims in different parts. Iraq is a huge nation. It's where civilization began. Those of you who take Western Civ know it's ancient Mesopotamia. It's where Abraham was born, in the city of Ur. So when we speak of Iraq, it's a very complex system of cultures and religions. As far as Islam is concerned, Bill asked us to react to that. Islam, much like Christianity and Judaism, is divided into different minor isms. A friend of mine who is a Orthodox Jew has very little to discuss with a Reform Jew because they're on two different surfaces in terms of Judaism. Within Christianity, as you know, we have hundreds of denominations that claim to be Christian, in addition to the traditional Christian churches historically. In terms of Islam, we have Shiites, we have Sunnis, we have Alawite, the president of Syria and his family, Alawite Muslims. We have Druze in Syria. We can go on and on. My point is we should not oversimplify these issues. They're extremely complex.
I think oversimplifying this war with Iraq as a war on terrorism is heading down the wrong path. I go back to communication once again. Saying that if you're with us or against us in terms of terrorism, you're painting a broad brush over the word. Is he going to go after the terrorists that are in England? Is he going to go after the terrorists in Russia? Is he going to go after terrorists in Colombia? Terrorism is terrorism. Now, is this war, going back to a question about the war, is this war with Iraq a war on terrorism? I believe it is not, because you're dealing with a sovereign nation, not with a group of people living within a nation. And if it affects, going back to a gentleman in the back, if it affects the terrorist link that may be out there between Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations and Iraq, then so be it. But that is an after effect.
Okay, going back to war as a conflict resolution, was there anything good that came out of the Gulf War, from the fact that we can now drive SUVs en masse?
This is also the oil question again.
Yeah. I mean, one could definitely make the argument that for Iraqis, there was not good outweighing the bad. I mean, Iraqi civilians have suffered the most out of anyone under UN sanctions for the past 12 years. And what the sanctions have succeeded in doing is destroying any middle class that Iraq had, and raising generations of kids who, you know, Saddam Hussein tells them, well, you don't have any medicine and your mother is dead because of the United States and because of sanctions from the UN. So that really wasn't very effective. But like you said, we did have lower gas prices, so.
In terms of oil, is Iraq really, is it our main source? I know we get oil from like South America, we have oil in Alaska, there's lots of different places that we get our oil. Is that really that large of an issue in terms of this war? Like, if we focus on that, is it really a thing to focus on?
The question is, to what degree is the United States dependent on Iraq for oil?
I believe that, well, first of all, Iraq is the second largest producer of oil, but I believe directly and indirectly we receive about 10% of our oil from Iraq.
I think that, may I make a point? I think the oil is part of it. I also do think that, and it's probably the majority of it, but I also think that I mean, President Bush has been pretty clear in saying that his Bush doctrine sort of is saying that he wants to sort of democratize countries, and he would love to see democracy come to the Middle East, and he would love to be responsible for that. So I think that also is a factor involved. But I think the majority of it's oil, though.
Okay, maybe I want to move to another point, like, because I lived in Palestine the last part of my life, and like noticed all the stuff happens when the soldiers enter the country. All I wonder is about the Iraq people, the regular people living there. If a wars happen, they will not just come and take Saddam and kill him, because if they want that, they can do it easily, as they can shoot anyone here or anywhere. But the problem is the people, the students, the store owners that living there. If the soldier entering Iraq, a lot of people will be killed, a lot of stores will be destroyed.
The question is about something we mentioned at the very beginning, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants.
It's unfortunate, extremely unfortunate. I don't like using the word unfortunate because it means unlucky. Okay? But a fact of war is that people will die on both sides. It is not the intent of any government to purposefully kill innocent people. That is never the intent. And going along with somebody about democracy in Iraq, think about our nation's democracy when the country was first founded. We came up with something known as the Articles of Confederation. And we had 13 separate states doing their own thing. And it was expected that right off the bat that people would understand what democracy was. In Afghanistan, it is the warlords that control that country, and the Taliban hasn't been thrown out of that country 100%. So democracy is going to struggle in that country. And we have certain factions in Iraq who still remember after 1991 that the United States did their business, came in, left, and then expected the people to overthrow Saddam Hussein. So democracy happening overnight in Iraq it's a pipe dream.
May I just read a point?
Yeah, quickly.
It'll be quick. Afghanistan has not been under the control of an empire since Alexander the Great, and they kicked him out. When we speak of warlords, we're meaning if you live in Burbank, that's a warlord. You live in Palos, it's another warlord. So Darren's comment is well taken.
Please.
Is there any clear definition for terrorism, or we just go after any country we think they're acting terrorism?
Again, the question is a definition of terrorism and maybe contrasting terrorism with war.
I think we sort of clarified that a little bit before, that, you know, it's again, it's sort of relative to what side of the fence that you sit
I
on.
didn't like the way you clarified it before. To me, there's a couple of characteristics of terrorism. One, it is not done by a competent authority. It is not waged by someone who has legitimate authority. And secondly, it seems to me that the purpose of terror is terror. There's no reason to engage in terror in order to negotiate. The terrorist wants to cause havoc, wants to cause terror. So, to me, it really is outside the bounds of some kind of competent negotiation or competent...
The moderator is now debating.
All right.
I mean, some are right.
Please. Do you think America is going over the limits of claiming war into other countries? I mean, this is going to be the second time we're going to go with war with Iraq, and we had a war with Afghanistan, plus the Russians with the Cold War, and probably, who knows? I mean, we're probably going to go to war with North Korea. So I'm just asking you, don't you think it's unsafe for the American people in this country? So America's going to war with any country it feels like. So I'm just saying, don't expect another September 11th to happen with other countries, because you're making more enemies. I think America's making more enemies this week.
The question has to do with the United States' propensity for war making. Darren, I was intrigued by a comment you made earlier that we are very short-sighted in our foreign policy. I wonder if you have any, first of all, reaction to this question, but any theory as to why that might be. Why are we...
Well, going back to the question of going to war with North Korea, or that's basically what you were getting towards, and I do believe that you're headed down a slippery slope. There has to be some sort of functional foreign policy that is long-term, such as if you do go to war, not saying for or against it, but if you do go to North Korea and you win, lose, what happens afterwards? One of the problems that we have in the United States with being so short-sighted is that we have a term-limited executive office. We have an expanding bureaucracy where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. You can't ask the Secretary of the Treasury right now how much this war is going to cost, because he probably hasn't spoken to the Secretary of Defense yet. And the Secretary of Defense doesn't have the budget written up either. And what you end up having is a situation where you have a two-term president. Let's say you have a one-term president. The president is kicked out of office. Now the next person who comes in has to deal with the policies of the past and come up with their own policy and try to rework it. It's not easy. So they think of it in short-sighted terms so they can just move forward quicker.
And if I may clarify that just by saying that, again, I think that also relates to our culture as we are a pretty short-sighted culture. We expect things in the here and the now, and we don't want to wait for it. And I think that also sort of ties into what Darren is saying as well.
I'm trying to recognize people that haven't spoken, but then I'll get back. Please.
Speaking to the short-sightedness question, I've actually been working really hard to stop this war, but at this point, I think that I've lost. What I wonder now is if we go into Iraq, we send in those 300 cruise missiles, we destroy the water system, we bring down the electric grid. I mean, that's what we did in the last war. That's why the middle class has been destroyed. Don't we have to sort of turn the toggle switch over and now start pushing and saying, we have to rebuild this country. We owe this country. I'm just curious what you would say about that.
The question has to do with what people who are opposed to war ought to be doing, and given the fact that war is imminent, what is, first, I like the way you phrased it, what is individual responsibility for rebuilding not only Iraq, I would say rebuilding this country, and then kind of a collective responsibility.
Yes, in reaction to your very good observation, as I indicated earlier, we have at least, the administration has indicated, a 2-year minimum stay in Iraq, which will include, obviously, the rebuilding Iraq. It's a monumental economic issue. And I always have to ask this question. I don't know where the money's coming from. just as you drive out of the campus, check your gas prices. We've been having a high gas price issue here for the last 3 weeks. I wonder why. I just don't understand in my simplistic way.
If we rebuild the country, do you want a rebuilding where the United States and the coalition forces, as small as they may be, actually do all of the work? They do all the work in terms of getting themselves involved in government and setting up the new infrastructure, such as they did in Japan? Or, right after World War II, or do you want a situation where, after 1991, you rebuild somewhat, you get up and leave, and then expect the people to take care of themselves, and then have another problem when the faction that's in power overthrows them, or kicks them to the ground?
It seems to me that we've had a very consistent foreign policy. For 50 years after the World War II, we had a boogeyman called communism, which justified us spending trillions of dollars to make the Pentagon and arms manufacturers richer. Then we looked for other boogeymans after communism fell, the drug war. Now we have terrorism, and it fits everything. I don't see any link between Iraq and what happened on September 11th. I think we're creating more enemies through injustice.
This is directed towards Mr. Gear at the end. You said that it's unfortunate, the collateral damage and thousands of civilians that would die over there if we were to attack tonight is unfortunate. And the tragedy of September 11th is that 3,300 civilians died. Not Army men, not Navy men, civilians. And the fact that we're going there, and I mean, what kind of value for human life do we have if we say that, oh, thousands of Iraqi civilians to die? That's unfortunate, but what are we going to do? What does that show? I mean, we believe in diplomacy just as long as it applies to Americans. But you don't have an American citizenship, and it no longer applies.
The question again is one about non-combatants. The way I would ask the question, I wonder if in the modern age it really is possible to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, the way war is waged today from thousands of miles up in the sky.
Yeah, just kind of answering her question and the gentleman's question about civilians. The Pentagon's estimate that it will be about 10,000 civilians who will die in this attack. And I have a question too. We already mentioned a couple of times about veto power and why does France, Germany, Russia, and China want to execute it. And all 4 countries want to execute it. And I just want to mention that the United States have executed its veto power again in the United Nations for over 30 times in the last 30 or so years on matters with Israel.
I was gonna say, like as far as like I know I've heard and I've read from what people have said about us helping out Israel. I know our country has supported Israel in the past. They've given them access to bombs and stuff that had USA printed across the bombs, and they were being used against the Muslims in border countries and everything. And I think like what our country needs to do. I think war is already out of the question. We're going to war, so I mean you can't really go back and say we're not going to war, so nothing's going to happen. If people aren't going to die, people are going to die.
We've had 2 comments about Israel. I feel so humbled to be on such an esteemed panel here, but I really am not yet hearing what this conflict with Iraq has to do with Israel, or what it has to do with the Palestinian question. I could use some clarification on that.
Well,
Iraq and the Palestinian question.
Yeah.
The Palestinian question has been with us since 1918, long before the establishment of Israel. There was a declaration called the Balfour Declaration under Great Britain, where 2 states were to be created, one for the Palestinian people and one for the Jewish people at the time, because of the divisions that were going on in the world. In 1948, Israel was created. The Palestinians wound up in seas and robot tents in the desert. Iraq, these are facts. Iraq, on the other hand, has absolutely nothing to do with the Palestinian issue, except that it's always supported the Palestinian people because they're fellow Arabs. And not all of them, I'm going to reiterate, are Muslims. When we speak of Muslims, we have to be careful.
Andrew, would you say the same thing about the Palestinians, to equate them with?
Yeah, well, there's a large Palestinian Christian community in the occupied territories. The majority, of course, are Muslims. So it's not a religious issue. Sometimes we get confused by that. It's not an issue of Palestinians because they're Muslims or Muslims because they're Palestinians. The Palestinian people have been under occupation since 1948, and my position is very direct. Until a Palestinian state is created, as was the Israeli state, we will see no peace in the Middle East, because we speak of justice, we have to be justified in terms of both peoples.
I want to know where, I haven't really watched the news lately, I just have been kind of turning TV off lately. I want to know where is Bush's justification in going to war? What is his outline for justification of doing what he's doing right now?
Iraq has violated consistent Security Council resolutions. It has weapons of mass destruction. What am I missing?
Well, he's making the link with terrorism.
Making a link between now, in recent weeks, we've been hearing about links between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein.
And that obviously is an amorphous link, not terribly clear, and under that guise, he gets people excited and nervous. It's a psychological tool.
And he would probably have a better argument if he said that he was doing it for the self-defense of its own people, of the Iraqi people. But the problem with that is that it's a slippery slope, that if you go after the self-defending someone else's country, then you're going to have to do it with everybody else.
What are some of you guys' views on the ultimatum that President Bush gave to Saddam Hussein and saying that, like, you know, you have to leave your country? Since that's never ever been done before, what do you guys think about that?
The question has to do with now Bush's mode of communication.
Will you repeat that one more time? Step.
What do you guys think about the ultimatum that President Bush gave to Saddam Hussein by saying that, you know, I won't go to war with you guys if you leave the country? Like, basically saying that Saddam Hussein has to leave the country in 48 hours, otherwise we're going to come in there and destroy the country.
It'd be interesting if Saddam left and we'd see what Bush would do then. My response to that is that that is perceived by many people outside and inside of our country, but outside of our country, as arrogance. The issue is not Saddam, because there are many Saddams in the world. Saudi Arabia, I'm wondering why he doesn't ask the Saudi family to leave Saudi Arabia, if you talk about repression. We know why he won't ask them, because of oil connections. Shall I go further? Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, oil connections?
We're down to just a couple of minutes. Please.
Okay. You're saying this war does not have enough connection with Israel. But it is, because Mr. Bush and his administration, all what he's doing is trying to make Israel the most powerful country in the Middle East or in the region. Overall, that you're saying that Iraq violated the United States resolution many times, where Israel did that many times. Okay, and all you're saying, Iraq has weapon of mass destruction. Israel has, and it is fact and known. Okay, they have 250 nuclear hits. One of them can destroy the whole Middle East. The United States is funding it and giving all the technology for Israel to do that. Okay, and the United States is not doing nothing. Actually, there is massacre every day in Palestine. The United States is not doing nothing. Why he's going to Iraq? Okay, just because he hates Saddam, he want to go attack him and get him out of power. Let his people decide that.
We're out of time. I'm going to let the panel members have a quick synopsis if they want to make a comment.
In reaction to the recent comment by the last speaker, the recent comments, what I think she's advocating for is a just peace in the Middle East. And America's an empire, and when you're an empire, you have awesome responsibilities in terms of even-handedness and fairness. This is one of the issues that is being raised, and it's a valid issue. No more comments now because we have to make a statement.
And again, I think that we want to be careful. We want to ensure that in this case the good will be outweighing the bad, and that hopefully, when this happens, that hopefully that Bush's rhetoric in recent days has been about promoting the creation of a Palestinian state. Hopefully, that will happen.
We hope, because
soon.
In terms of this issue,
said justice, not war.
In terms of this issue or any political issue, I always tell my students, read and respond and communicate and ask questions. And continue to do so, not just with this issue, but with other issues that affect you directly or indirectly.
This has been a great turnout. You all deserve commendation. This is a testimony to the strength of our country that we're able to get together. It is perhaps not likely and maybe not even desirable that we do the same kind of thing again in the library, but I really hope that we're all open to having this kind of forum again in the coming weeks.
Thanks for coming, everyone. One more round of applause for our excellent speaker. And there's one announcement that Mary needs to make about an upcoming event.
For those of you who are interested in continuing this discussion, on the 27th, a week from Thursday, there will be a student-led discussion again about whether or not we should be at war in Iraq, or whether or not we should be going to war in Iraq.
26th.
In
26th.
109.
26th.
No, the 27th is Thursday.
Oh, okay.
27th.
There's another one on 26th too.
Okay, there's one on the 26th as well, and that's with the Arab Student Union?
Yeah, and the Muslim Student Union.
Okay. The one on the 27th is going to be in B109 from 12 to 2 p.m. I've got some flyers here. If you are interested in coming, I'd love to see some of you there. And the other event is on the 26th.
Yeah, it's on a Wednesday, B109, 2 to 4.
2 to 4 in B109. We hope to see as many of you there as are here today. Thank you.
And for my students, stick around, whether you're in this class between 1 and 2:15 or any other day, just stick around. We have some things to talk about.